in this episode?
Yeah, exactly. When you study cognitive science, what I particularly really enjoyed was that you don't only study, well, cognitive science is one field, but you have to study the subfields. But you also have to learn a lot of like philosophy of science, basically. Like, how can we ask questions? What do those questions tell us and what do they not tell us? Because often we have very naive notions of what something means, right? Like if I write a program, does this directly tell me something about how a brain works? Well, probably not, right? Like how do I even transfer this knowledge? So you have to learn all the subfields to some degree. You have to learn what unifies them, but you also have to learn a lot of philosophy of science. So you have really this very broad spectrum of knowledge and skills and, well, insights that you have to have over time.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the cognitive scientist Anna Riedl, who does research on rationality under radical uncertainty, and also, in fact, recently released a paper with John Viveki on relevance realization. This has to be one of the most informative episodes that I've done, probably in the history of the podcast, because Anna put together something called a cognitive science map, where she lays down the history of cognitive science all the way from how it emerged and how it's developed. And in this episode, we went through the main epochs, let's say, in the history of cognitive science. I kind of discussed some of these periods and some of these thinkers and theories, and all the way from psychoanalysis to William James, his pragmatism, to now more fully cognition in the, let's say, the contemporary research being done. And to be totally honest, after the podcast, when I was thinking about it, I felt a bit bad because I felt that I sort of cornered Anna at certain times by asking her certain questions on very specific fields, which you wouldn't expect a person to have a knowledge in, because we were trying to cover a very broad body of knowledge in the history of cognitive science and even psychology. And obviously it was unfair for me to ask these very specific questions in a certain area without giving her a heads up before the podcast so that she could prepare. So Anna, apologies for that. I really didn't mean to corner you. I just got a bit excited by everything you've outlined on the CogSci map. That being said though, a bit of a housekeeping note. This, in fact, the reason I wanted to do this episode was because I was kind of inspired by Anna's appearance on the Dissenters podcast, the conversation she had with Ricardo, where they did go through the cognitive science map a little bit at a higher level. And when I was listening to that episode, I realized there were so many parts that I would have liked to explore more. And so think of this as a follow-up from the podcast she did with Ricardo, as more of an elaboration on the CogSci map that she's put together. It's a very useful resource. I have it just on my desktop, and I refer to it all the time whenever I'm kind of exploring something on the domain of either AI or CogSci, or any of the tangential fields to cognitive science. But having said that, the point I want to make is, the housekeeping note I want to make is that I know a lot of you listen to this podcast, and this is again one of those episodes where it's probably better if you watch it, because we do run through the CogSci map, and it's probably easier having it visually out there for you to see what we're discussing within the map. So I hate doing this, again, because I know most people prefer listening to podcasts, but this is just one of those episodes where you kind of have to visually see what's going on. So if you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other platforms, do consider checking out the YouTube video. I'll leave a link to it in the description on the show notes down below. That being said, a bit of a formal introduction to Anna, as I tend to do with the podcast. Anna Riedl is a cognitive scientist who researches rationality under radical uncertainty. She completed her undergraduate degree in psychology at the University of Vienna and did the Middle European Interdisciplinary Master's Program in Cognitive Science. Anna was a researcher at the Viennese Institute for Artificial Intelligence and Decision Support, and a member of the global Shapers community organized by the World Economic Forum, serving as curator for the Vienna Hub. And on the note of Vienna, Anna has fully convinced me, that the next city that I've got to visit when traveling is Vienna. Especially with the intellectual history Vienna has in the 20th century. That being said, here's my conversation with Anna Riedl.
When I came to my cognitive science master, and I come from psychology, we heard like ideas like about Heidegger and so forth. Like someone mentioned Heideggerian AI, right, related to whatever, like whatever subject. But back then, I was So coming from such a strong frame or like way of thinking from psychology, I just thought those people are so esoteric. They don't know what they're talking about. This is ridiculous. And I had to learn so much for ideas like Heidegger to actually make sense. And now I'm like, yeah, of course it makes sense to talk about those problems and to bring in the questions that Heidegger raised. But back then, I felt like so, oh my God, they're wasting my time here. Why are we talking about this? Why are we just starting to program a mind and be done with it? Why do we have to do all this philosophy? And Heidegger is like for me now the symbol of looking at something and dismissing it because it sounds so ridiculous, and then later coming back and understanding, no, you just like, you were an idiot. You didn't know what you're talking about.
Well, I mean, although no, I wouldn't necessarily say that like to be like the you were idiot, all that, because like Heidegger, to be honest, like I find personally, I've been reading him for about 5 years, and I've really been trying to get through his work.
Yeah.
For me, it feels like he makes it unnecessarily
Oh
convoluted,
yeah. Of
or he
course. Oh,
offers.
definitely. No question about that.
Yeah, which is why I really like Merleau-Ponty, which is like it's like all of her work always refers to Merleau-Ponty
Yeah.
and Simone de Beauvoir. This I'm going
Yeah.
through this again now. This phenomenology of perception.
Oh, amazing. I have not
Oh,
read
and
it,
I
but
like
sounds
he writes so clearly, and like he's just like onto the point, and he also refers a lot to the natural sciences, and that makes it quite nice for us to read, because at the end of the day, we live in a world where that's like, in some sense, our working episteme, to use a term by Michel Foucault, is science, right? We view the world through and I think rightly so. So therefore, he's fantastic. Whereas like a lot of the other continental philosophers, they sometimes, not all of them, but
oh, you,
Heidegger for sure obfuscates. Yeah.
yeah, you really have to filter out the way of writing and kind of give him a credit for like developing some of the ideas while not taking the style too serious. Yeah, I agree. But I feel like also like when you establish ideas for the first time, it's just like you're often just like hinting in a direction, and then over time they become simpler, right? So like often when I don't understand something the first time, it feels very chaotic, and then over time that simplicity has to develop, right? Like to really cut to, this is the most important point that like needs a lot of pre-processing, and I would like understand works like his as basically doing this rough hinting at what he's talking about. And of course now we can way more like distill what the central ideas were in retrospect. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. That idea of retroactivity is like a big thing, I think, even in like for my thinking, because obviously I never understood any of Heidegger by reading Heidegger. It was through Hubert
Yeah.
Dreyfus. It was through another great commentator was Simon Critchley, who wrote a really good book on Heidegger. And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
I see where they're getting it. And then once it clicks, though, it kind of seems quite obvious. They're like, oh yeah, this makes total sense as to how we, make sense of the world and perceive the world. In fact, Anna, one thing I want to ask from you is this regarding your work, the cognitive science map. Oh,
Uh-huh.
I only noticed this morning. Why is it that in that map, why isn't phenomenology on the map? Like, do
Oh
you
my God.
like?
No, there's so many things missing. I think I also explicitly write this on my website, right? The more I learn, the more I'm aware basically everything important is missing, which is always a problem when you try to visualize something. But I think, right, like the map is clearly lacking in many ways. And if I had like a lot of time and would see it as my primary project, then I would also update it, but it just isn't. It was a project in the past, and continuously updating it is just not like, would take a lot of time and work. But yeah, I mean, obviously it belongs there, right? Phenomenology is super important,
See,
as are many other things.
makes a lot more sense. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, also like as you've specified on your website, as you pointed out, it's a work in progress, right? I mean, also you're trying to
Yeah.
capture a history of human cognition in some sense. I mean,
Yes.
one would even argue if you go back all the way to Kant, if Kant was alive now, he would be some
Yeah.
kind of cognitive scientist,
Probably.
the way he
Yes.
theorizes.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But my two main ideas with the map were like, first for myself, right? I was close to done with my master's,
yeah.
but I realized I had not mastered cognitive science at all. I felt like, wow, I feel like I really still know nothing, but I really want to really understand it. So I wanted to organize my own understanding, and visualizing it really helps, because you also have to make the decision of what is the most important, right? And what can you leave out? So for myself was the main idea. But then, of course, when you make an artifact, then others can also use it to learn. And also, because it is now externalized, it creates this affordance where others can either point out where I'm wrong, because otherwise we would have to linearly discuss through it, right? Like, I think this, but now you see it all laid out roughly, and now you can say, oh, this is completely missing on your map, right? But also you can use this artifact now as an affordance to create your own thing, right? You could just like use the PDF and then just like edit it yourself, right? I mean, I'm also happy to send the original Adobe files, and people can just play around and improve it, because I want a better version, and it's way easier once there is already something out there that can be improved upon, instead of someone having to start from scratch. And there's this idea that the easiest way to get the right answer on the internet is to put the false answer on the internet.
I've seen that.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the underlying idea, basically.
Especially on Twitter and Reddit. Or X,
Yes.
I guess. Yeah. But yeah, on the note, Anna, like one thing, firstly, when I reached out to you, that was firstly because like I want to talk to you. I love the way you elucidate ideas, and I've learned a lot from listening to your work online. But also, secondly, I was thinking that this could be sort of like let's call it an elaboration from the conversation you had with Ricardo on dissenters. That's where I found you, through Ricardo's podcast, because I love that you both started kind of breaking down and going through some of the faces in the map. And I was kind of like, ooh, I had a lot of questions while you were going through it. And I was like, could you expand on this bit? Could you maybe elaborate on this bit? Now, I'm not expecting like a full-on historical exegesis of everything being possible. We need to do like maybe a 10-part lecture series for that. But
Yes.
the goal was to, okay, yes, you have your work on rationality and some other work you've done on relevance realization, for instance. But let's just focus on the map for this podcast, and we can go as deep as we can into it and kind of discuss the ideas. But how does that sound?
I mean, happy to start. I'm pretty sure my knowledge will stop very, like, I have not even read everyone that's on the map. But I'm very happy to like overall give like a bit of a sketch, yeah, and talk about it.
Yeah, no, totally. Again, we don't have to. It's going to be impossible to go through each, different discipline or school of thought in the period. But I think it's interesting. The term cognitive science is thrown around a lot, and I'm not saying that we need to define what it is, but it's probably interesting to see firstly why there's so much interest around it, but then why it's like one of those interesting disciplines that is like very interdisciplinary. It's like, be it AI, be it psychology, neuroscience, mathematics, complexity theory, like there's so many different disciplines that come together, or linguistics, of course. And that's kind of what interests me about the field. On the note, like I don't know if you want to get into this, so if you don't want to, it's totally fine. But just because, I guess, to orient the listener and for them to get a taste of what cognitive science is, maybe kind of, as a working cognitive scientist, maybe you could discuss the recent paper which is, by the way, great job. I read it. It was fantastic. The recent paper you released with John Vakey and a few others, which is naturalizing relevance realization, why agency and cognition are fundamentally not computational. So I thought this paper would be a fantastic example of the kind of questions and areas you would explore as a cognitive scientist. So perhaps if you could just give us like an introduction into the paper, like what you were trying to explore in it, but also maybe extrapolate that as like into the broader field of cognitive science and the questions that you're asking.
So just as a general notion of like what cognitive science is and what unifies it, cognitive science has multiple definitions or ways of understanding it. Some people call it like the scientific study of the mind, right? Or the brain, or like mind, brains, and machines. But what is different from other disciplines that also study related ideas is that cognitive science is on the layer of analysis of information processing, right? So it asks how different entities, whether it's minds, brains, or machines, on the layer of information processing follow unified principles. So some people have also called it the study of intelligence, or there's also other synonyms like basically applied epistemology, right? Like how can something, like some entity or a system, come to know something about the world and, well, basically reach its goals in it. So in a sense, it's also very directly about the question of intelligence. It's very, like, it's hard to tear apart. And because this layer is what unifies it, it's of course extremely interdisciplinary because, well, we have neuroscience, it looks at the brain in particular and how a brain comes to know or processes information. Then we have psychology, which is about, well, humans in particular, because, well, also non-humans also have brains, right? So, but psychology is in particular about human cognition. And then, well, we also have AI and computer science and how computers process information. And when we look at the map, for example, right, you can see that the idea of information theory was extremely important to establish cognitive science historically. But of course, now we also have newer understandings of what cognition is that are not necessarily directly tied to the idea of information processing, but way more like right, there's for e-cognition that talks way more about like the direct coupling between the organism and the environment, and way less about this symbolic processing of information. So, well, as a general, like, laying out of what cognitive science is, and then also like how it has developed roughly, which is also relevant for our paper. And where did I want to go here now? Yeah, exactly. When you study cognitive science, what I particularly really enjoyed was that you don't only study, well, cognitive science is one field, but you have to study the subfields. But you also have to learn a lot of, like, philosophy of science, basically. Like, how can we ask questions? What do those questions tell us and what do they not tell us? Because often we have very naive notions of what something means, right? Like, if I write a program, does this directly tell me something about how a brain works? Well, probably not, right? Like, how do I even transfer this knowledge? So you have to learn all the subfields to some degree. You have to learn what unifies them, but you also have to learn a lot of philosophy of science. So you have really this very broad spectrum of knowledge and skills and, well, insights that you have to have over time. Yeah, so far to just like laying out some basic notions around cognitive science. Also, please jump in if there's something where you would like not disagree or like think something else.
Oh no, I completely agree. I was gonna just ask a follow-up question regarding the more philosophical aspects of cog sci, but I would love to, you know, just for us to you to give us like a bit of a taste of this paper you did with John Vervaeke on relevance realization, because I think it's a perfect example of what, let's say, what makes cognitive science distinct from a field like AI, for instance, which has like a lot of papers in be deep learning or LLMs or whatever the case may be. But yeah, before I get to the philosophical side of things, if you could just give us a bit of a introduction to this paper, please.
So first, I have another paper forthcoming with John Vervaeke that's basically the first, chronologically speaking, but is not yet published, which is about rationality.
You're on fire. I'm saying you're on absolute fire. Just pump out papers. Yeah. This is your third paper with him, right? This is your third. This is the third one, right?
This is the first one published, but the other one is the chronologically the first. So this is the second, I would say. But we have way more ideas of what to work on, or we are working on more things. So the first, like chronologically, the first is rationality and relevance realization. And this paper that now already got published is called Naturalizing Relevance Realization and was published in Frontiers in Psychology. And it's a collaboration between Johannes Jäger, who is a theoretical biologist, or like started out as a geneticist, is now a theoretical biologist, who was my master's thesis supervisor. And then it's the further collaborators are, well, John Vervaeke, then Dennis Walsh and Alex Djedovich. And we bring all those ideas together of like my collaboration with Yogi, but also work that Alex has done under supervision of John and Dennis at University of Toronto, also related to cognition and theoretical biology. Like really, right? There's this strong tension between the computationalist or cognitivist paradigm in cognitive science, and then more ideas from, well, biology, or like how we know that life works, which is also what all those newer ideas of, well, the free energy principle and so forth are doing, right? Like this,
and yeah, all of that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes. And well, the main idea is well, that it point, like the main idea of this paper is that it really points out how different organismic or like organismic agents or organisms are from like current, well, machines or algorithmic problem solving in already pre-formalized worlds. And we try to lay out kind of the main structure of the internal and external constraints and, well, how intelligence works like that. And the main idea is that organisms have to turn ill-defined problems into well-defined ones. So exactly this tension between, right? So in a simulation or a pre-formalized world, everything is already calculable. While in an open world or like, well, really like the world, problems don't come pre-specified like that. So it's a completely different problem that has to be solved. Yes.
Yeah, perfect. But yeah, look, I have heaps of follow-up questions on this paper because I only read it this morning, so it's fresh in my head. But for the sake of time, I'll hold on to them hopefully for our next conversation if that's okay, Anna. But the next question is, as I said before, is I rarely meet a cognitive scientist who hasn't got some kind of philosophical inclination, who's interested in some kind of the more of the broader philosophical questions. So the question would be, why is there such a close relationship between cognitive science and philosophy?
I mean, I think that's what I already hinted at before when I said of, right, like what you learn when you study cognitive science. And that's precisely because you move between different levels of analysis and different phenomena. And then you, for example, you transfer knowledge from one discipline to another. Then you have to always ask yourself those like meta questions of what are we doing here? Are those inferences justified? What can we learn from one system that applies to another? And why is that so? So you automatically have to ask those questions if you want to do it well, because otherwise, right, you might exactly sit in front of your computer and write some code and think you've just created a mind, which because you just dismiss that an action like that brings many philosophical assumptions with it, whether you ask them or not. So ideally, you want to ask them and be clear of your assumptions, because otherwise, if you don't ask them, you will make assumptions and they will probably be wrong.
Yeah. I have a thought on this, and I'm keen to hear what you think. You know Mel Andrews. You guys did refer to her work in this paper too. I just spoke to her recently, and one interesting point she makes is that, oh no, they makes is that in the history of science, ever since Bacon, there's always been this kind of almost like a penchant or tendency to remove the subject away out of the scientific process and just make it a purely kind of data-driven enterprise without any theory. But as we have seen, it's virtually impossible to remove the subject from any kind of scientific enterprise. There's always going to be the observer, all the way from in quantum mechanics, the observer problem, and then this probably manifested, or the epitome of this was maybe in the 20th century with Niels Bohr, the Copenhagen school, where they said, "Oh, shut up and calculate. Don't theorize. Don't ask the foundational questions." But what I found interesting with cognitive science is that it's like this. It's a deeply scientific discipline that you can't remove the subject from. The subject has to always be there, and but then the other problem is it's subject studying other subject, what a subject is. So, and I find that's why in some sense, the philosophy always comes into that. You can't escape the philosophy because it's theory, and what do philosophers do? They theorize. So
yes, of course, yes. exactly reestablishing that we are first person subjects, or that we have a first person view also when we come to asking philosophical and scientific questions. Is important to remember, because, well, the ideas we come up with are probably also limited by the minds we already bring to the problem of studying the minds, right? We will come up with ideas that are intelligible by who we are. So yeah, of course you can go deeper and deeper into this, but at some point it also bottoms out and you have to just do something and and say this is the best we can do, because otherwise it's just recursive, right?
Yeah, it becomes like a reductio ad absurdum. Cool, Anna. To be mindful of the time, shall we get into the map? I've got it opened here. So, the first question I had is, now, obviously, when an outsider looks at this map, it looks very teleological, right? I mean, the arrows are pointing that way. It looks like it's like a teleological progress or like linear progress. But realistically speaking, I'm wondering, like, I'm sure in reality this is only a map. The map is not the territory, obviously. But there were a lot of like overlapping fields, and it wasn't the case that there was like this build up towards something called cognitive science, but rather it kind of emerged in like the 70s and 80s. Is that right?
It already I mean, it was founded earlier, so I think people officially date like the founding of cognitive science to the year 56. But yeah, because you said it's like teleological, I don't think so necessarily. The errors mostly mean just the progression of time here. I do not see it as a teleological process.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just thought of I'd mention that because it's interesting. Like, as you were saying before, probably before we started recording, in retrospect, a lot of things look like they were necessarily supposed to happen, but but that's only in retrospect. In the moment, it's just complete chaos, and then something emerges out of it. It's in many ways it's purely contingent.
I mean, you understand the relevance of what happened in the past by being now, right? It's also actually this is super related to the idea of relevance realization, and also sometimes, for example, categories. So, for example, Karl Popper talks in The Myth of the Framework about the problem of, well, what is a historical artifact, right? So if I don't remember exactly the story he tells, but he talks about, is a train ticket a historical artifact, right? Like, you every day you could like take the train and you have a train ticket, but maybe one day something really particularly bad or great happens, and now looking back, this might be an historically important artifact. But on the day you couldn't know that today would be the day where it's not just a random train ticket, but something that would later be considered a historical artifact, right? So that's exactly how the history is also, like history of ideas are also in a similar way. Right? Like later you will understand, oh, this has worked out and this has not worked out, like evolutionary dynamics, right? Like many ideas form, and then some work out and some don't, and many just die out. And well, that's how it goes.
Yeah. That's a pretty cool anecdote. I haven't come across it, so I may have to message you later to ask for it. So the first bit I want to discuss is, of course, psychoanalysis, which you've highlighted in the section past. So perhaps maybe discuss what really is the connection between psychoanalysis, which now is mostly dealt with in like the arts side of in academia, or perhaps in English departments. But what's the connection between psychoanalysis and cognitive science?
Well, psychoanalysis was, of course, super important for the history of psychology, right? There were many ideas it established that we didn't have before. Actually, it's hard to remember what the most important ideas there were, but probably the idea of the unconscious, right? So it also dethroned humanity philosophically from this like throne of like having this absolute reason that we apply at all times, but like establish this idea of having an unconscious, which to this day we still use all the time, right? So that I think that is very important. Because you say it's only used in the arts, or like it's not so dominant anymore. I was very skeptical and dismissive of psychoanalysis when I started studying psychology, because psychology, from its like the paradigms it uses, are usually quite opposed to psychoanalysis. And in particular in Vienna, the faculties have really like separated a lot. So the psychology department, they're very, very mathematical and statistical, and the psychoanalysis really moved out. But now that I have studied cognitive science, I think there were many very important ideas in psychoanalysis that we would still agree on. So for example, there are many ideas of, oh God, how are they called? Defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
Right, in the psyche. And when we
Anna
now,
Freud. Yeah, Anna Freud. Freud's daughter came up with those. Yeah.
exactly, and when we now think of everything we know about cognition in life and how it is about like an autopoietic system maintaining itself, that also makes sense that, well, the idea of defense mechanisms, maybe not exactly as they put it, but that we would have something like that you reject information that would harm your self-image and so forth to like maintain coherence. All those ideas I find quite plausible, and well, we shouldn't throw out too easily. I think there's often a lot of wisdom in old works like that, and well, the more you know over time, the more you see that it's very hard to just dismiss all of those things too naively. There's also great work, in particular in the field of decision making, by David Tuckett, who is both a psychoanalyst and works in finance. And he has a book called Minding the Market, and he also works with other researchers that come from a predictive processing framework, and that makes complete sense. And he says the central idea of psychoanalysis is that people do not suffer from emotions; they suffer from ideas. And that also, again, I find completely plausible, because if you have certain assumptions baked into your framework or in your way of thinking of the world, this can really mess with your ability of, well, skillful coping or just like adapting to the world. And all of this I find extremely plausible. So I think psychoanalysis was a super important step historically, but to this day, there's a lot in there that you can take seriously, and well, that will definitely add knowledge to your perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with you, Anna. But one thing I'll probably just add to that is I spoke to Iris Berendt
Yeah.
few months ago, and she said it's, leaving aside the unconscious certainly was an important discovery without a doubt. But
Yeah.
one thing Freud did was he kind of brought to salience, or brought to the kind of the academic dialogue, that the mind could be something that we can study, that the mind isn't like this, because historically it would be called the soul, it would be left to more to like theology, and almost like this transcendental, let's call it object, that we couldn't ever study in kind of a analytic, philosophical, or scientific way. But Freud really, despite, people like Karl Popper saying psychoanalysis is a pseudoscience, which I agree, I don't think psychoanalysis is a science. The fact that he said, okay, we can study the mind. The mind isn't just something that's just there. It can be brought into the, let's call it even the scientific discourse. I thought that was a good point that she made.
I wasn't aware he was the first one, but I certainly made it way more salient, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point Iris made, Professor Barrett made, was more in the sense of bringing it into more of the sciences, because obviously before Freud there were many philosophers. I mean, Descartes spoke of the cogito. There's Nietzsche, of course. There's Schopenhauer. There are a lot of people who spoke of the mind in this way, but there's something where Freud tried, at least as a first step, to bring it into the sciences.
Yes.
Him and of course people like William James, from the pragmatist tradition, which is the next one I want to get into. Again, this is not, despite us presenting it in such a way where it seems teleological, it's not teleological. I mean, a lot of overlap here, but yeah. So just on pragmatism, perhaps what is pragmatism, and how does it relate again to cognitive science?
I don't have a definition at hand, but pragmatism is
Super high
this.
level. I mean, you don't have to like go deeply into it. I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, how would I summarize pragmatism in one idea? The main thing that sticks for me is that William James reframed the idea of what truth is. It says like ideas that work are, or like that function well or have good consequences are what constitutes truth, similar to like how we use categories and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, William James was still more of a philosopher, he was a philosopher, but I think he was one of the first people that started using the term psychology and kind of created a discipline called psychology in some sense. If again, please fact check me on all
So
of
if I
this.
mean, when I now look at the map here and also like how I remember it, and I think William Wundt and also Hermann Helmholtz have been associated with the establishing psychology. In particular, Wundt had the first experimental psychology lab, I think, in Leipzig in 1879 already.
Yeah, I don't know who neither one of those people are. I have no idea, so I need to look them up.
So actually, it's super interesting. So I read that we already had psychophysics before by Fechner and so forth. We had like Fechner's law and things like that. But Wundt like really did a lot of like very experimental empirical work already back then. And Helmholtz is the idea that oh my God, the person that is often associated with the idea of active inference. Like he studied perception.
Okay.
And well, he already gave some basic ideas of this idea of how what we perceive is the difference between what we expect and the information that comes from the environment. And this was already said by Helmholtz in the 19th century, or no, probably then in the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah.
Interesting. I didn't even know that active inference went that way back into history. I thought it was a very recent idea. That's so interesting.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, I mean, the idea, like how it is now established, is a recent one, or like understanding how important this idea is a recent one, because we had a long period where people did understand perception as this way more passive uptake of information and not as this active inference. So the new relevance of this idea is recent, but it has been said way back historically, for example, by Hermann Helmholtz. What's even more interesting is, of course, if you go further back in time, there have been many other people who've also already said that, or similar ideas. So, for example, I have a book here about the theories of vision, where you can go back to like old polymath in different centuries, and they already had many ideas of like how the mind works and how, for example, perception works. And of course, many of those ideas in retrospect feel very esoteric, but often they're very, very like well put analyses already in there that we would now come back to and still agree with. So I think that's also one of my main learnings in doing this map. But when I started out, I felt like, right, like, oh, well, there are those people way back that were super naive, but now we're doing proper science, right? So this very naive notion that, oh my God, you can dismiss everything from the past, and people basically were idiots that were like very, very primitive. And I think the more you read history, like historical ideas, the more you understand, no, people were already basically like we are today. Of course, we have more technological progress and definitely progress regarding how much information there is that we can access and then interact with. But people had many of those insights, not just in the 19th century, but also already in the 5th century, right? Like it's very like the more you know, the less optimistic you are about just like how much progress we've really made. We've just often just understood better how right people were already long times ago.
Yeah. No, beautifully put. I mean, a very, very perspicacious point, because I couldn't agree more. Especially this, which is why I'm sorry if I'm repeating this point almost ad nauseum. That like I wanted to articulate before we started that this is not teleological, because we're doing so much of retroactivity and we're referring back and bringing back ideas. And for instance, case in point, active inference, or even the concept of active inference, that it was already there in the late 19th century. That's quite mind-blowing, given active inference really only came into the more of the public dialogue, let's say, after Carl Friston and would you say the 2000s, or I don't know, early 2000s, or regardless.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and which is why I think something like this kind of map and understanding the history of a certain field it's not just some kind of historical analysis, but it can even enrich the work we're doing right now in the moment to refer back to these thinkers and these schools of thought,
Yeah.
let's say.
Maybe one day I will do also a map of the this is the 20th century of the 19th century, because that's of course where many of those ideas actually were like occurred, and a lot of the foundational work was already done, right? Like that we still do often also refer to implicitly. So that will also still be very, very interesting to actually do.
That would be a huge project, though. I mean, especially the more you go back, the more texts you have to read, and then before you know it, you're at Plato. So
I disagree that I think it would be less work, because I think there were just like less people in science like the centuries before, and because we have more historical context, we have a better understanding who in retrospect were like the most important people. So I think it actually becomes easier, and I feel like, for example, doing work on the history of ideas of the last 20 years is way harder, because there it's very hard to say what were the most important. I mean, for some it's quite clear, right? Like ImageNet was very, very important. But also but a lot of the selection will still have to occur, and now deciding who was important and who wasn't is way harder. I think the further we go back, it actually gets easier.
yeah, you're probably right there. Maybe my thinking was a bit flawed, because like I recall in Gödelischer Bach, Hofstadter, he makes the point. He has this particle called chunking, and he says chunking is something where we take a whole lot of information and then we chunk it and then we abstract it out to a concept. And
Yes.
it's much easier to chunk, let's say, 100 years of information or like intellectual work than the past 20 years, because in the 100 years, you with time, the most important ideas, they purely contingently they emerge that as these being the most important ideas. So then it's easier for us to understand them through like an abstraction. Whereas in the past 20 years, it's a lot harder, because there are all these papers being published, there are all of this work being done, and even we aren't sure at the moment which ones are going to be the groundbreaking ideas, or the ones that need to be given more salience over the others. So I can see what you're saying there. Yeah. Um so if you could humor me for a bit, Anna, I want to discuss Kurt Gödel. I
Oh
mean,
no.
I've been obsessed with the incompleteness theorem, and of course, probably with Hofstadter's book Gödelischer Bach, he really connected it to AI, and we don't have to go too deeply into the incompleteness theorem, but just to reiterate, the two theorems that he puts forward are that for all formal axiomatic systems, there are truths about that system that the system itself can't prove. And the second theorem, of course, is that a system can't prove its own consistency. And he used Whitehead's and Russell's Principe to prove this, which he kind of in many ways showed that mathematics itself has this problem of incompleteness, being an axiomatic system. But now a person who's like, what does that any of that have to do with cognitive science, right? I mean, we're talking about formal systems, logic, and mathematics. So maybe if you could just tell us, why in the world is Kurt Gödel in a map on the historical development of cognitive science, Anna?
I'll try to say it simple in how I understand it. So I would say there was this naive notion, again, of what mathematics can do and how it describes also what cognition does. That there's a very simple analogy between like abstract symbolic processing and cognition. Basically, that's exactly what a mind does. So when you also go back through mathematical papers, then the idea of probability theory works, for example, thought as, I think, the laws of thought, right? It was not just like, oh, this is an axiomatic simple system, but it was directly thought of as this is what, well, cognition does as well. So there was a very strong analogy in how we thought we could describe, well, a cognitive system. and then understanding, well, not even yet how much the analogy lacks, but even that those ideas in themselves have fundamental limits in what they can and cannot do, was of course a very important turning point in our understanding there. So understanding that even if we have all the numbers for something, or a full axiomatic system, that even there are fundamental limits in what we can calculate in principle, was a strong, how do you say it? A strong, yeah, as I already said, a strong turning point.
It was a proof. It was a formal proof that Gödel gave, right? Yeah. Nah, I agree. I mean, the reason I asked this was because for me, this is why the beauty of cognitive science, a field you'd never think would have anything to do with the human mind, is deeply connected to the human mind, especially as to the kind of what the assumptions people like Russell and White, well, not Whitehead, more Russell, made in the 20th century about how we know how we know truths about reality, let's say. Yeah, perfect. So the other one is I was thinking of Jean Piaget. Yep, sorry, go ahead.
So in Vienna, when they opened the new computer science department, they actually invited Douglas Hofstadter to give the kind of a welcome keynote, and he talked through the whole incompleteness theorem back then, the whole proof.
Did you attend?
As a founding keynote of the computer science department in Vienna.
When was this?
I don't remember the year, maybe 2017. Something like that. I might be wrong here, but something like that.
Because I don't think I'll ever be able to do this, but one of my one top people I want to speak to on the podcast is Douglas Hofstadter. I doubt I'll be able to make it happen, but now he's great because he, apart from the book, but also his talks on elucidating the more of the let's call it the cognitive scientific implications of the theorems are fascinating, and he makes all these isomorphisms that you wouldn't think are there, but then he shows, yes, there are these isomorphisms. I'll look that up. I'll see if I could find the talk online. I don't know, maybe I could.
I don't remember whether it was recorded, but I remember he talked through the whole text in detail. At a time where I didn't understand so much about it yet, so I definitely could not follow it, but I was very honored to listen to it.
Oh my God, that is so cool. I wish I was there. I wish I was a fly on the wall for that. But just for the I mean, even maybe for you, but for the listener, this book, Gödel's Proof, is, in my view, even a better book than Gödel Le Shabak at understanding the theorems. It's by Ernest Nagel. This is what really helped me to get the theorems. This and the mathematician Jill David Hampkins. Those two are fantastic at teaching it.
Okay, I also got my favorite book here related to those ideas, Exact Thinking in Demented Times. So it's actually about the Vienna Circle, but it of course starts out around ideas like, well, also Gödel's ideas. And it was written by Carl Sigmund, again, a Vienna mathematician. And the funny thing is, related to what we just talked about, that the introduction was written by Hofstadter, because he was a big fan of the Vienna Circle and was very sad that he did not have the opportunity to translate the book himself, because he loved the idea so much, and he also speaks both English and German, so he wanted the one to translate it to English, which didn't happen, but they ended up doing the book tours together nevertheless.
Oh my God, I didn't know. I don't know this person, know the book. I'm gonna order it immediately. In fact, it's not. I realized
it's one of my favorite books. It's like everything is colored. I've read it probably 10 times.
I love it. It's funny. I was gonna order it now, but I realized we are in the middle of a podcast. So after the podcast, I'm gonna order it immediately. Yes. Oh, thank you. Excellent. I'm obsessed with the incompleteness theorems.
Yeah, so what I love about this book in particular, which is also related to the map, is that, of course, all those ideas are directly embedded in, well, they're done by real people that live real lives. And in this book, you can learn a lot about both the Vienna Circle, but also the people behind it, right? Like, so, and also their circumstances, right? They lived through, I guess, multiple wars, or at least one war. they also, for example, their ideas about philosophy, they led them to very, very large disagreements on, for example, political ideas. I think Otto Neurath was a very strong socialist, and other people of the circle would strongly disagree with him. So it's very interesting to see all the messiness behind it, how the scientific and philosophical ideas interact with the people's lives, and then also the history that people live through. So this is one of my absolute favorite books of all time.
Okay, this is going to be high on my list. And also, I like the in demented times because, yeah, those certainly were demented times, unfortunately. And it
Yes.
seems like we're going to go there again soon. So hope not. But that's a whole other conversation. The other person is, of course, Jean Piaget, another very popular name. I mean, you know, Peterson refers to him. I haven't read anything by him, just only a few things online. But yeah, what was the importance of Jean Piaget, and then this idea of cognitive development?
So his main ideas are about, well, childhood development, like childhood cognitive development, where you have a couple of phases where, well, children are able to not make certain inferences, and then they have a transition, and afterwards they are able to make certain inferences correctly, or like reason correctly. So you can very clearly pinpoint cognitive abilities that are not yet there, and then they are there, and also failure modes, or for example, generalizations. And so forth. So in that regard, his work is like empirical, but also very strong theory. Where I don't know like what we know about all of those things today, but I'm pretty sure we still agree with many of the ideas that he brought up.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I do know from the very little I know is that the word you said empirical. He certainly was he did like a lot of experiments with children, and he was a very empirically driven thinker.
Yes.
Yeah, which is why
Yes.
his work is still kind of, it's been absorbed into psychology and even of course cognitive science. Um,
Yeah. So for example, right, like one of the ideas was just the idea of object permanence.
yeah,
Well, the children, for example, can not yet understand that just because they don't see an object anymore, it's still there, it still exists, and then reason accordingly about the object. And there's a stage where at some point they have this ability, and this is of course, I mean, of course, like super important to understand those things. And then it also helps you to understand many of the sub abilities that a mind has or needs to have to deal with the environment, of course.
the next one, the big part of this, of course, is behaviorism. So with B.F. Skinner and all of them, I've got to admit, despite being interested in the field, I know very little about behaviorism. I know the name B.F. Skinner and some of the
Oh,
experiments
okay.
with animals. So if you could please give us a bit of please take your time with this. Yeah, with like behaviorism and why it was this big moment in the history of psychology, let's say, uh,
Mhm.
with figures like B.F. Skinner.
So the idea of behaviorism is, well, it's a paradigm that studies the human mind and behavior from a particular perspective or in a particular way. And I would say it was a reaction against many of the well, attempts or well, study programs that happened before, where, like, for example, right, you had associationism before, or introspection, all of as a method. You had all of those things before, and they don't feel particularly scientific. And then the idea was, well, let's treat the mind as a black box. We just cannot know at all what is happening in the mind, and really just study it as like the mind, or like humans, as an input-output system. Right, so that's exactly what, for example, Skinner did, or also what or Pavlov did, where they just thought, okay, if I give this thing that I don't know anything about, this kind of input, what comes out? And then you have basic ideas, like the idea of reinforcement learning comes from there, right?
Yeah.
So, if I give the system more reward, more behavior comes out. Or like the idea of classical and operant conditioning, where, well, if I associate like a stimulus and a reward, or whatever, over time it will, like a certain behavior will come out, like through this association, right? What is it? The dog that's salivating when it produces saliva when it sees certain food, and when you also ring a bell, then later, even if there's no food, if the dog hears the bell, it will also produce saliva. So all of those ideas come from behaviorism, and it was, of course, an important step, right? Like you just throw a lot of things out that are hard to study, and where also, in a sense, a lot of bullshit probably creeped in, and you just say, hey, for now, let's pretend we just cannot study this because it's very hard to study and we don't have the methods. So let's just pretend it's a black box, and we just study the system from like, what can we actually observe, right? What can I do to the system, and then what can I really observe that it does, like the externally observed behavior, and then how can I relate one thing to the other? And well, it's a reductionist method, and it makes complete sense. And also up to this day, it's important that exactly those paradigms are not progressive in a sense that we say, oh, we have now, because now we have cognitivism, we have now completely overcome behaviorism. That's not true, because behaviorism as a paradigm can still be very functional to think about certain things, because often it doesn't matter what is going on in a system. I just want a certain outcome, and then the question is, what do I have to do, right? So when you think of, for example, like advertisement online, then you also wonder, well, how can I make more people click? Right? Of course, it can help to understand how they work, but you can also just like A/B test it, and just like this gives more clicks, right?
Almost like from like an engineering mindset, just get
Exactly.
it done. Yeah, without theorizing too much. Yeah, I mean, I think that you used the perfect example. I was just going to say that, in fact, reinforcement learning. For me, that's mostly what it is: treating the ML agent as a black box, and then just seeing what comes out of it. And as we've seen, and what's interesting is, as we've seen from the LLMs and GPT, we get surprised. I mean, no one was expecting this kind of. I don't think even. Well, I'm just speaking here as an outsider, but I don't even think that the researchers in OpenAI expected some of these LLMs to be this effective, but they are. So that's quite interesting.
But also this historical idea of like behaviorism shows again, right, how all those ideas are related, because now we have in machine learning, one subfield is reinforcement learning, and the fundamental idea came from psychology and the work of the behaviorists. So this is exactly how all of those ideas are related.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The next, of course, before we get to the kind of the next, which is the cognitivist and like Chomsky's whole critique of behaviorism, I want to kind of, let's say couple a few fields together just to make it easier for you. By the way, thank you so much, Anna. You're doing a fantastic job at elucidating all these points. So if I were in your position, I don't know how I'd do it. Even if I knew what I was talking about, it'd be too much to convey in like a succinct manner.
Yes, there's I mean, often I would wish to like now like actually first read the article again to just like get all the details correctly in my head, so I don't like give wrong pieces of information here. But roughly I'm happy to lay it out.
Nah, it's all good. I mean, I'm gonna record an introduction, and I'm gonna put a disclaimer saying this is just a conversation. So, please do your own research. And I'll try to leave as much resources as I can in the show notes. So the other three would be system science, cybernetics, and game theory. Again, interesting fields with big figures like John von Neumann. Okay, so maybe I'll couple them together. What's their relationship to CogSci?
Well, John von Neumann, he also, I mean, he developed many ideas that are now still relevant. Like both like the first structure of the computer was by him, if I remember correctly, but he also did very important work in, for example, game theory.
He invented the field,
which is still, sorry?
I mean, he was one of the founders, or let's say godfathers of game theory.
Yeah. And right, game theory is still the foundation of, and for example, when you think of multi-agent systems, you still need all of those ideas to axiomatize the fundamental questions that certain fields are asking. And because we are talking about a historical map here, I also really like like again, putting it in context, because not only did he develop multiple of those ideas, I think he also advised the US government And then questions like game theory were not just abstract ideas, but they were directly relevant for ideas during the Cold War, right? Like, how do we respond with two superpowers? How do you calculate what you should be doing? Because what would a rational agent on the other side do? And how, right, like, how should you behave to, well, not both die and so forth. So those ideas always were, on one hand, very abstract, but they also very directly related or then used in the historical context by those people. So that's what I found so interesting. And also when you go a bit lower, even like I have this bubble for the World War II, because also often in science, the progress does not just happen by, well, people randomly having new ideas, but also by new technology, and the technology often comes from historical context. So a lot of the computing devices were developed specifically for World War II. And then this caused the revolutions that we could later also use those new advances for scientific studies. But it was not purely for trying to understand the mind, but it was for real world problems like, well, winning a war, right? Ideas like signal detection theory and computer theory, it was all very related to the warfare at the time. And just seeing how those ideas, right, how you cannot just say, well, there's the scientific enterprise and then there's other parts, but they are often extremely related. Also, when you, for example, look at behaviorism, I think back then the paradigm, or like for how, well, like how the US government thought about many questions, they did ask questions like, how much can we change humans, right? Ideas like, can we create the ultimate soldier or something through certain, well, learning environments? Those questions were asked during that time. And then, of course, questions like behaviorism are like powerfully related to questions that were asked by governments. And those things all mutually influence each other. Like the ideas influence what people in certain institutions would think is an option, and the other way around, like what the goals are, like winning a war would influence the questions that were asked. So in the end, everything is extremely connected, but you have to also understand how to pick things out to study them individually.
Yeah. I mean, it's also very dialectical because, an example that I really like is the printing press and the Gutenberg press. A lot of people, claim that, well, one reason for the Protestant Reformation, which is probably one of the most important historical moments in I was going to say the history of the West, but I would say in history of the world in general, is because of the Gutenberg press and the fact that now you could print things, and that caused the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther and all of that. And then, as you pointed out, well, Anna, yeah, like Stalin and the Soviets, they thought you could like recreate human nature in some sense. And then the question is, what is human nature? Is there human nature? There were all these questions that came back and forth with the scientific developments that were heavily connected to the political developments too. And as you were saying that, I kind of feel like you and I, in many ways, as narcissistic as this sounds, are living through such a moment with the AI revolution. I mean, who knows the political implications and this kind of back and forth going on with the AI revolution. And
I think, right, like we create technology or like artifacts. I mean, we as in like collectively, I'm not personal, but humanity creates artifacts or technology, culture, and then it influences us back, of course. Like the next generation is already completely adapted because they don't even know that there was a time before it when they grow up. Like later they might understand, but right now they're just like, this is how the world is, and they adapt to it. And of course it does create a new kind of person. And there's also new demands on cognition, which, I mean, has also been heavily discussed. Like, for example, right, like how, like, for example, regarding mental health question, how just the whole, like the modern condition is, of course, very like complex. Like you're not just, right, you're not embedded in nature. You have to hold a lot of information in your head that you have to adapt to. It's a very particular world that we live in.
Yeah. I mean, if we could get very speculative here, Heidegger in his essay, The Question Concerning Technology, he even makes this point that we think that ideas drive human beings, but rather for him, like he uses the term Dasein, but for him, technology itself has already its own metaphysical status. So it's not
Yeah.
like technology are just objects, and it's just subjects with like with who do metaphysics. For him, technology itself did metaphysics, and he was trying to break this dualism between mind, body, or subject, object. And one example he used was technology, and then of course the nuclear bomb and the things we're discussing here. So
Exactly. Like technology also, of course, in cognitive science always serves as a metaphor for what cognition is. And when you go back historically, this has always been the case, right? Like whether for what God does or what humans do, for God, right? Like the world is a book, things like that.
yeah,
Or
that's
I
a very
think
good point. That's a very good point. Yeah.
there was also the idea, I think, that the mind is like a catapult or something historically, or a hydraulic system for sure that has definitely existed for the brain, that like, right, like the muscles work like a hydraulic system by like fluid coming out of the brain and like, right, like things like that, which we know is not the case. But those ideas, like the technology of the day has always influenced our ideas of what cognition is doing as an analogy. And then, well, to some degree, that definitely helps. For example, today, I think the computer metaphor is really definitely one of the most powerful metaphors and ideas we have. And the technology in itself is also very powerful. But also this analogy, again, has, of course, parts of the reality that it does not transfer directly or represent.
Yeah. I recall reading an essay or like a letter she wrote, Ada Lovelace, one of the founders of computing.
Yeah.
And yeah, she was talking about the idea of like we humans are also like mechanical systems. And at the time, she was using the the machine as an example and she was like, and then she was even kind of theorizing that in the future we could create this kind of mechanical system like a human. It's fascinating stuff. Okay, the next big, I would probably call it a paradigm. I don't know if that's a proper term. Is cognitive psychology. And I mean, we see in that time, so you put it here in the 1950s, we have the birth of cognitive science, as you mentioned. For some reason, I thought it was a bit later, but yeah, 1956, as you mentioned. And then we also have cognitive psychology, and then certainly with Minsky, McCarthy, artificial intelligence, the first generation of artificial intelligence. I should probably also mention, Alan Turing and the famous Turing test here too. But a lot here, so I don't know what we're going to call this period, but maybe just speak of this era in the 1950s, please, Anna.
So when we zoom in the cognitive psychology or cognitive science cluster over there, so there were a couple of important publications that challenged this dominance of behaviorism in academia. So some of the important works were Chomsky, who wrote a review of verbal behavior and wrote like syntactic structures, where he shows, well, we cannot study language from a purely behaviorist perspective because you have to assume something inside the black box to be going on. So behaviorism is just not suited for this goal, and it also is just wrong. We definitely do know something, and we know that there is something going on in the system. But there were also other publications like by Tolman, the idea of cognitive maps, which shows that I think rats do not just solve a maze by, well, remembering, oh, aha, here and here, right? I just have to go always to the right or some simple heuristic like that, but they actually have an internal representation to solve the problem. So again, showing that there is definitely something going on and that we can know what is going on because of empirical experiments. So there was this turn from behaviorism to cognitive science or like cognitive psychology. Also, George Miller's The Magical Number 7 was very influential because back then, because of information theory, we thought a lot about cognitive, about psychology through this lens of how much information can be like held, for example, or can flow through certain capacities. That's exactly what George Miller did. He had this idea of channel capacity in the memory system and showed that the working memory holds roughly seven chunks of information. right, like 7 plus minus 2, where he just shows like how much can working memory roughly remember. And this was, of course, one of the papers back then. I think there's also a paper by Miller specifically about his experience going through the cognitive revolution. Yes, which I didn't say right now, but this is all explicitly called the cognitive revolution in psychology, because, well, it went from behaviorism to cognitive science or cognitivism. And yeah, there were many other publications like here, broadband, perception, communication, and so forth. And it was at the same time that also artificial intelligence was founded, with some overlap of the people, but also two different streams, theoretically, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have to go on. I mean, MIT, they started I think the artificial intelligence lab during this time, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, with Minsky.
Yeah.
And all.
So I chose 1956 because this is where the famous Dartmouth summer workshop on artificial intelligence was founded, where basically many of those people came together to solve AI over the summer, which is also the first
AI over the summer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This first idea of this like overconfidence also that always was in the field. So, right, like one person would solve language, one person would solve reasoning, and so forth, and then they would just put it all together, which was the first, like, you can read the document from this conference in particular.
Interesting. Yeah, I heard of that, but I didn't know the whole thing about solving it over summer. Well, over here, I've got to mention I would even call him one of my intellectual heroes, Hubert Dreyfus,
Yes.
who wrote, Being in the World, but also What Computers Still Cannot Do. I mean, Minsky and Dreyfus were going at it. Hubert Dreyfus was working in an analytic philosophy department, but he was bringing in so-called continental philosophy from like Heidegger and Ponty and even Foucault, and there was the idea of the body and being in the world. So it's I don't know, very stimulating and fascinating intellectual debate that they had at the time.
Yes.
I don't know if it's fair to put you on the spot here, Anna, but like just so that the listeners have somewhat of an understanding of you can see my screen, right? I'm sharing. Somewhat of an understanding of what first gen AI, how they conceptualized AI. If you could comment on that a little bit, apropos what we discussed with cognitive psychology and all of that.
How do I best summarize that? So I think the general problem solver by Newell and Simon might be a good idea. I think, if I remember correctly, they were studying chess playing, and, well, basically the mathematics of how to do that. I'm actually Googling it right now.
Yeah.
But so I think they had a chess playing system already back then that, well, solved this problem in particular. And then, of course, you had already ideas like Rosenblatt's perceptrons, and so forth. So even like many of the ideas that we apply now with like more layers and so forth, they already existed back then. Like many of those, right? Like those ideas are not so recent. Just like the ability in applying them are the recent ones, but the underlying ideas, they're really quite old, and many decades old.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. So and then we have this kind of. So one thing I kind of wanted to discuss, of course, the symbolic AI, that's with Minsky, symbolic logicist, that's for sure. But so cognitivism it's still related to kind of what Chomsky and he created through linguistics, isn't it? What we call which is a current paradigm in many ways. Let's say with the how AI is done currently, they kind of the conceptual framework is cognitivism, or maybe I'm wrong there, but what is cognitivism? People like Daniel Dennett, cognitivists, they kind of work on it.
Well, it basically just brings the idea of information into psychology, and also like rejects the idea of this black box. It just says, well, there is information processing going on in the mind, and we can study it through either the analogy of information processing directly or in many other ways. So it just basically opened the black box. That's what cognitivism is. And what I actually completely neglected is the idea of, I think, computationalism in particular.
Computation.
Where you look at everything through the lens of computation.
I see. So that too is kind of coming off from this like symbolic logic way of thinking, and then what like Turing and all of them were doing, right? What he introduced, let's say.
So you had the symbolicist or logicist approach, where you think of all of that as just symbols, like computation of symbols directly, and then later it became like it got way more used as this idea of like a dynamical system, like computing those things, but it's not explicitly. It basically became symbolic. Well, I've not talked about those things for a while. It's like not super fluent right now. It became symbolic, I would say, and you thought of it way more as through the lens of a complex system. And you already also had the idea of connectionism, right? Like many like neurons together processing information on an exactly sub-symbolic level.
Excellent. Okay, so the next one I want to get into is this, and which is very interesting. Autopoiesis and embodied mind. I mean, the recent paper you wrote with Viveki and the rest. You guys mentioned this, and embodiment is a big thing, especially in Viveki's theories. So, in his work. So yeah, just if you could give us a bit of an introduction. In 1972, which is a while back. These are the Chilean biologists, right, who introduced this.
Yes.
So yeah, autopoiesis and then embodied mind.
Yeah. Oof. I think you would probably also have to start a bit earlier, even.
Sure. Sorry, I've skipped some.
No, it's fine. I don't even think I mentioned the earlier works or where that actually was. But the idea is that the fundamental question is first, how do you ground those symbols? Right, like how do they relate to the physical system? And then you have to turn to the whole 4E cognition or embodiment in particular, where you say that the body does play an important role, both we know this in neuroscience, of course, that the body plays a role, right? Like that even the information processing is not just done in the brain, but a lot of it is done in the body. But also for cognition, the whole being, including its body, is relevant for what we're doing, and that a lot of it is not just us calculating in a context-free Platonic space what to do, but a lot of it is happening directly through the body and not just the mind.
Yeah, or like some abstract, almost like a cogito. It has to be embodied. Yeah. And again, just to reiterate, here's where I would highly recommend looking into Merleau-Ponty's work, because firstly, very clear writer, but secondly, he uses a lot of examples from what we're kind of discussing here, in fact.
Yes.
And well, in fact, let me try here. Just I think this is going to be valuable. So for instance, a symbol would be something like, we say something like dog, and then we have the word dog. But of course, the word dog isn't a real dog. That's just it's a signifier, or it symbolizes an actual physical dog in the physical world. So the question would be then, for a symbolicist, when we have all these symbols, do they symbolize the real thing? And then where does the real thing exist? And of course, this leads to very interesting philosophical questions about, scientific realism, mathematical realism, this idea of the math is not the territory. I just spoke with Mel Andrews about this, and they was very good at explaining the idea of, realism and non-realism. So I think here is, again, to connect it back to that previous question I asked you, where kind of all these fields become deeply philosophical. I'd say. So back to autopoiesis, Anna. If it's something we hear a lot of people in the free energy principle, that group, they talk about the FEP people, but yeah, what is autopoiesis? And then I guess the embodied bit we already discussed, but what is autopoiesis?
So it explains, or basically it brings the idea of the life back into cognitive science, I would say, that right, like a cognitive system, or the ones we are interested in, like humans, are living systems, which means they're self-maintaining. I think one of the publications they did was really looking at how can a system self-produce its own structure. I think they show it with a program, actually, but we don't just act, but we self-create, like we self-maintain, and the same has to be applied to also our cognition, that it continuously, how do you say it? Like I really have to look up the terms they use, but like maintain the coherence, or like right, its own structure in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm writing a novel, and I'm trying to like explore this and like through fiction, this idea of autopoiesis. And like one basic thought that one of the characters has is like, I mean, how in the world is it that we even like we even cognize the world, and the world makes sense to us? Like why don't we just like explode in like an information overload, or something in that vein? But the fact that it seems like we at least ostensibly we have this idea of like a consistent self, and then we are acting in this world, and then we we are I don't want to say we survive, because that makes it look more like natural selection, but the fact that we kind of, it's as if we're creating ourselves every single day as we exist in this world. So, and that's for me where the auto bit comes in, that we're self-creating beings. I don't know if that made sense, but I'm trying to kind of use analogies to like immediate phenomenology, let's say, because at least from what we can see, non-living beings, non-biological beings don't do that. But it doesn't look like they're creating and acting in this world. Rather, it's just there. And this is probably this is what I found interesting about the questions they bring up about with the idea of autopoiesis.
Yes, right. Like we also have to maintain homeostasis.
Yeah, exactly,
Uh,
exactly.
Really, and also it also questions the separation between agent and environment, which we have in any AI book, right? There's the agent and there's the environment, and also in ideas like behaviorism, that's of course the case. But when you think of it more as a living thing, we also understand, of course, that the organism itself was already formed through evolution. So in a direct coupling between the organism and the environment, there is already a lot of pre-selection of how of the relationship going on in the first place. So there's a way more direct coupling, and even the question of what is the environment becomes way fuzzier immediately.
Yeah, perfectly put. Perfectly put. I kind of, in my kind of list of the stuff I wanted to discuss that we're going through, I had, after autopoiesis, Bayesian networks. But I want to
Yeah.
ask from you, Anna, because this is a bit of the updated version. Is there anything else you think worth mentioning before we make the sensible jump to Bayesian reasoning? Any other?
Oof, I think so in general, right? Like, I mean, we are just like to zoom out. We are trying right now to go through a lot of information, which either someone is already in the field, where they will probably notice that we're quite wrong about many of the details of how we put things right now, or they know nothing about the field, for in which case this will be highly overwhelming. So I think we're probably not doing the perfect job for either of those. So just to address that, on the poster, in the corner, there are the resources I used. Actually, many of the historical summaries, they're quite easy to read, because many textbooks like Introduction to Psychology, Introduction to Artificial Intelligence, a Modern Approach by Russell and Norvig, they have a historical section that is often just like 20 pages or something, like not super long, where you can quickly really read through all of this information for yourself if you've not heard it and you're just like right now hearing us jump randomly between things and not really understanding the flow of the individual disciplines, and it doesn't really make sense. I would just really look at the historical sections in classical textbooks, whether it's neuroscience, psychology, AI. It's often very well done, and I think that's where I would start if our jumping around doesn't make so much sense right now.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd mention two things. First is I wanted this podcast to be an impetus to go and read those material. And secondly, as Anna mentioned, it's all on your website. It's all of the resources that you regard the books to read. I saw them on your website. If not, I'll email you and I'll put them in the show notes too. So we should definitely provide those resources. But should we probably the reason I wanted to touch on Bayesian reasoning
Yes.
is only because it seems to me I see, well, not Bayesian reasoning per se, but Bayesian inference a lot used in active inference, and it seems like one of those things spoken about quite a lot. But why I'm suddenly lost. I can't find. Oh, there we go. Bayesian network. Sorry. So we know it comes from the from Bayes. Is it George Bayes? Is his full name? I forget, but he was a theologian. Yeah. It's a bit of a, it's an older. Say again?
Thomas Bayes.
Thomas Bayes, sorry. Yeah, Thomas Bayes. It's a bit of an older idea, but it's ubiquitous. It's used in so many different, all the way from physics to be it sociology or in this case cognitive science. But yeah, what's the relationship between Bayesian inference or Bayesian reasoning, and then what you mentioned here, Bayesian networks, which I found quite interesting.
I mean, I would just start out with talking about Bayesianism in general.
Probably a good idea.
So Bayesian, an approach to statistics. There have also been quite some, I would say, like some wars or disputes in how to approach statistics between frequentism and Bayesianism. And the idea of Bayesianism is relevant for cognition because it does basically start out with a knower that has certain current assumptions that then get changed through new incoming information. So there's also the idea of subjective and objective Bayesianism. So the idea is you have some prior knowledge, right, a certain probabilistic belief about something, and then new pieces of information come in, and then either your probability goes up or down depending on what the information is. And this is, of course, a really nice basic idea of how cognition could work, or like how we could abstract from cognition. And we apply it as well to just like statistical questions. And the main switch there is also from logic to probabilities, right? Instead of like saying, I believe this yes or no, or like 1 or 0, I go to credences, like degrees of beliefs, which is of course a very powerful move because we never like actually fully know a thing.
Yeah. I mean, here I'd mentioned this book, Active Inference, and in the first part, the low road to active inference, they go through kind of exactly what Anna explained, and they use like an example of, okay, if you're looking, if an agent is getting information and has a belief that it's between an apple and a cat, I think they use, and it's like, okay, so the more information you get, you have your probability it increases or reduces depending on the information you get. And they even go through the mathematics, but leaving aside even the mathematics, just conceptually, they use really good examples in the book. I just mentioned that.
And of course, also Bayesianism in itself is also used in philosophy of science in general, right? It's an assumption of how rational agents should be reasoning, and it's also the idea of how that science progresses in that way, that we refute, or like instead of that we basically have certain assumptions or theories about things, and then given the new incoming information, we change our beliefs.
Yeah, I'm not going to be eating for the next week because Anna is recommending too many books, and I'm going to go broke buying all the books you recommend. So I'm just going to stop. I'm going to stop. I'm joking. I'm going to stop.
Yeah, as a living system, I do not recommend to you to not eat for a week.
That's true. There you go. Yeah, autopoiesis, right? Yeah. Excellent. Okay, that was good. I think we covered that quite well. So let me just look at my list. What's the next thing I wanted to discuss? One other thing I want to touch on is this idea of cognitive neuroscience. I find that quite interesting. It's quite a big field nowadays. But yeah, in the 1980s, there was the emergence of cognitive neuroscience. So what is it, and how does that differ from what you'd call historically neurology or neuroscience?
So neuroscience is, well, the study of the brain. And how it works. And then cognitive neuroscience relates the level of analysis of cognition, right, of information processing to the brain structures. That's how I would describe it.
And so it inferred from there. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I don't think there's anything more to put there. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it kind of influenced by cognitivism and all of that. The other thing I want to ask is, Anna, regarding this modularity of mind. I've heard you mention Jerry Fodor in some of your other podcasts and on talks too. So just if you could kind of discuss a bit of that too.
I actually think Ines Hippolito mentioned him.
Oh, was it Ines? Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Yes,
I've confused.
I think Fodor.
I'm sorry, Ines, if you're listening. I apologize. It's been a long day.
Yes. So a modularity of mind refers to the idea that that the mind might be structured through certain innate mental modules that have like distinct functions they are serving, to like not understand it as one unified system, but one that has many subsystems.
Yeah,
I would say.
as the name suggests. Yeah, you know what? I'm sorry. For some reason, I thought you mentioned it, but it was Ines.
Maybe I did, but
Yeah,
maybe I did.
I'll follow up and ask from her on that, because I thought it was an interesting kind of way of thinking about the mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's so many like detailed questions that you're asking now. I think like to just like zoom out a bit more and like make some like bigger sense making of what's going on in the map. So one bubble in the computer science or AI timeline that I find interesting or relevant is the idea of the AI winter, which
Yes, I was just
when
going to
you
ask about that.
when you read the history of AI, there were often very, very strong, well, hypes were also like it was very relevant in like for just like investments were going on. There was a big belief of AI solving many of our problems, and now maybe also taking off in a certain sense. And then it afterwards, many of those promises were not met, and we had an AI winter where AI research did not get a lot of funding or also not a lot of attention. And I think this is in particular interesting to know for people who are maybe now at the age where for the first time ever they hear about AI because it's currently very, very dominant in the media. To understand that maybe it does not mean that there's a AGI around the corner, but it is another hype cycle. Of course, we do not know, right? It's very hard to predict the future, and it might be different this time around. But given what has happened in the past, it is also very realistic to assume that we will now have a lot of developments, but then also not be able to fulfill certain promises, and that at some point it will also like become a bit calmer again for quite some years before there's a new like batch of developings happening. So just like to understand that we have had this before, I think that's just relevant for the current moment in time as well, to understand that, yeah, of course, it might really be the next big thing, but we have also thought like that many, many times as humans in the past. And I think many AI researchers are not as optimistic because they have seen like times like this before, and it has not always then turned into AI solving all of humanity's problems.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that kind of utopian thinking, it's kind of, the Tower of Babel kind of thinking is quite imminent in the kind of the epistemic arrogance, let's say, of some of us in the world of AI. Yeah, I mean, it's also worth mentioning, probably. I think you make a good point, and I like people who do overhype AI. It's generally people who are in industry more for like commercial purposes, in like marketing or whatever. But the actual scientists and researchers, they're very conservative, and especially the philosophers, because as you pointed out, we've already been through the AI winter, and we might perhaps go through another one soon. So
Multiple.
yeah,
Yes.
I mean, maybe it's gonna be winter after winter, c'est la vie. So
Yeah.
the next the next one, I don't know whether we should like discuss, because you're right. I apologize for asking very specific questions. I just some of them I just find I'm quite intrigued, let's say. Should we discuss rational analysis, that area, or do you think there's anything else before we get to that to touch on?
Mm,
I see you've even
yeah.
met Gödel Hesjepark, the book too.
I can feel a bit like the tension of like what I'm interested in and maybe you're interested in, and that what might serve the listener more.
Perfect. Yeah,
Um,
that's perfect.
so,
Yeah.
so for I think like the big chunks to like just like quickly cover, like I've mentioned here the decade of the brain up there, which was like this funding period where like a lot of brain science was funded, I think in the 1990s or 2000, maybe the 2000s, oh no, 1990s. During the time, that was when a lot of the imaging technologies really took off or like became way better. And then a lot of new research of like just localizing things in the brain or observing brain functioning like could finally happen. So that was a very important decade in neuroscience. Which again shows, right, like how the technology influences what is done or what can be done. And then going back in time, one of my favorite publications ever is the levels of analysis in cognition by David Marr. The book is called Vision, and he analyzes the vision, the system of vision, and how it computationally solves its problem. But more importantly than this solving the problem of vision was laying out the general idea of 3 levels of analysis in cognitive science, which is also relevant for computer science, I assume, or just like to think like that, which is on the upper level, the computational problem, really the function that is to be performed. But then at an intermediate level is the idea of an algorithm that transforms, that actually solves the problem to fulfill that function. And then on the lowest level is the implementation level, like the physical implementation, whether it's biological or synthetic. So this just like really helps to be aware where in the level of analysis you're currently moving, because all those levels are like different questions. And I find that very important to keep in mind, or it's one of my favorite publications. It's also I also like his personal story a lot. I mean, I don't like it, but I find it a moving story, because he was actually terminally ill, and he wrote this book on his, I would assume, basically deathbed, and it got published posthumously. How do you say it?
Posthumously. Yeah.
Exactly. That's the word I'm searching for, and I think he died extremely young, if I remember correctly, at 35 or something like that.
Do you mind mentioning the book again, please, Anna? What was it called?
Vision by David Marr.
Vision by David Marr. Excellent. I'll leave a link to that too. It's a computational investigation into the human representation and processing of visual information. Fascinating. I never heard of the book nor him. So here's another one so that I can replace one more meal with the book. Perfect. But yeah, so okay, rational analysis. This is where we're kind of making a bit of, I hope you're not jumping too much, but because I kind of want to discuss 4E cognition at the end, as that's the work that interests me, that you and Vicky, and kind of even connected to Friston and all of them. So maybe I want to leave that towards the end. So what's rational analysis, and what's that area, let's say?
Yeah. So I would say it's basically the idea of, I guess, functionalism, the idea that the mind or cognition is optimally evolved to solve certain problems, and well, then using, oh God, I don't know how to say it right now.
We do. Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I mean, let's just, for the listener, there's a time.
No, wait. Actually, I Googled it. Wow, great. The goal of rational analysis as a research program is to explain the function and purpose of cognitive processes and to discover the structures of the mind. Yeah, exactly, right. To really think of it like, what are the purposes and the functions of certain parts, like assuming it has evolved to optimally solve some problems. And the question is, what are the problems? And then also, how does it solve it?
Yeah, so my understanding of functionalism is sort of like, I'm trying to think of an example here. Perhaps let's say, let's use a very Darwinian survival, that sort of, function. And then, you're hungry. And when you're hungry, you want to eat food to get rid of that hunger. I mean, then with the function there would be kind of the cognitive function is you go and look for food. Is that kind of the idea in rational analysis?
I guess so, but I would
Yeah, I
have
was
to
like
look.
too simplistic. Yeah, I mean,
Just-
this clearly proves Freud's point that human beings aren't rational creatures, because I'm sacrificing my meals for next week with Anna's book recommendations.
that doesn't sound like a
Oh,
good strategy.
yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Yeah, I have the problem right now that I've read so much in the rationality sphere that I don't know anymore who has said what precisely. So I can't say
Yeah.
what anymore.
Also, it's interesting the fact that you're developing kind of on the idea of rationality right now in your like ongoing work. So but again, if we get there, we're not gonna have time with that. I really would like to discuss that in a separate podcast. Um, Okay. Yeah, I think that leads us to the end of this. Well, again, this apparently teleological map, which, by the way, to repeat, is not teleological, is this idea of 4E cognition, which is certainly fascinating. And then along with that, we have some other very interesting fields, which is of course predictive coding, and then, for instance, free energy principles. So how would you want to like handle this? Do we discuss FEP and predictive coding first and then get to fully cognition, or do we just
I
tackle?
think I want to skip discussing that because I think other podcasts have already covered this quite well, and I would
That's
rather
fine.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
we should
Just
probably just go
literally just
to
Google
people
FF.
who
Just
actually work in this full time. But just like to go into like 4E cognition as a paradigm shift that also happened is this idea, right? Like cognitivism has this idea of cognition calculating in this like detached way, how to think about things, while 4E cognition standing for extended, embedded, what are the other four? Embodied, and what was the fourth one?
enacted or
Enacted, exactly. Ways. So it emphasizes different parts that are neglected in the other paradigm, which includes, well, the body is relevant for how cognition functions, to also like ground symbols and so forth. And also cognition is not so much about like calculating some true thing, but it's about actually solving the problems of the environment. So it's way more about this perception action loop enacted by the body. Then exactly, and this is also what enactivism says. And then extended, it also shows that cognition is not necessarily to be thought of as being contained in the brain, but it extends in the environment. For example, we humans use artifacts for thinking. If I have my phone next to me, then in a sense, my cognition is extended by the phone, because if it was accidentally in my brain, I would say it's part of my cognition. But if I use it outside and I use it for information processing, it's also, of course, also part of my cognition in a sense, at least now that I have it. All of those notions got developed and taken more seriously, and also even then also integrated back into other ideas that they are indeed very important to think about.
and a big part of this is bringing back the body into cognition, right? Like the idea of that, where the body and the arena, the agent arena relationship. Yeah, excellent, excellent. I think that's really where I kind of wanted to, the kind of build up was towards that, because that's for me personally, that's the part I find most interesting about cognitive science, the idea of the body. Although, just again speculatively commenting here, you have put you or the team that put this together, the group of people have put quantum computing, and that's I guess and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding here was, we have people like Roger Penrose, who argued that, the brain is not computational. He uses Gödel's theorems. And then, they have this idea of microtubules where there's like a quantum wave collapse, and that's what leads to consciousness. So highly speculative. But like,
Yeah.
I'm assuming the reason quantum computing is also a part of cognitive science is to see if, if that paradigm in computer science or computer engineering, if that could give us some insights into cognition, or is that wrong? I completely got that wrong there.
No, I would not put quantum computing as a part of cognitive science at all. If I have put it on the map, then just like to locate it historically. And of course, because the computer metaphor is so powerful in cognitive science, then understanding
I
that
see.
our fundamental ideas in computer science have also advanced is somewhat relevant to understand cognition. And I think there is also some work done between the fields. But it's not my specialty at all, so I don't even want to comment on it. But I'm pretty sure there is work done, but I wouldn't directly put it as part of it at all.
Yeah. Nonetheless, it's just fun to think about these things. I was going to ask you one other question. This is going to be the penultimate question regarding book recommendations for people that want to get into cognitive science or study it. But you already recommended so many great books. But let's say for someone who's just stepping into the field, who probably only heard the word, maybe one or two books that you think are a good place to start.
A very good book to really start is by Bermudez, Introduction to Cognitive Science. I think that's just like a really excellent book to just start out.
I think I own that. Yeah.
There's other books as well, but I really liked his one in particular. There's also multiple versions.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Paul Taggart also wrote some good books. Mind, I read his. It's a pretty good introduction to CogSci too. Excellent. So one last question, and I'm going to ask you to be not Nostradamus here and predict the future. Yeah, but just like generally, given you're in this field, you're publishing, you're doing work with other cognitive scientists. There's like what's kind of current ongoing interesting work you see in the field, and what do you think are going to be the future developments? If you could just speculate for a bit.
Well, it depends a bit how you conceptualize cognitive science, right? Do you see AI as part of it or not? Are we really talking like this particular interdisciplinary field that is also somewhat philosophical? There was actually a paper, I think, in Nature called "What Happened to Cognitive Science," just I think it was published in 2019, around the time when I made the map, around like some trends in cognitive science in particular. That it was basically filling up more and more with cognitive psychology, because it was also meant to contain other disciplines like anthropology and so forth. So I would assume that this also probably continues, right? And that it also that we will also use more and more cognitive science to study AI systems now, because there's so much happening that it's very easy to now apply cognitive science methods to study, for example, the capabilities of large language models and so forth. So I would assume, on one hand, more cognitive psychology, then more in like everything related to the free energy principle and predictive processing, and then using it way more to study current AI capabilities. And then instead of thinking about human cognition, we apply it now to those systems that became complex enough to actually be interested in what they're doing exactly, because you can no longer understand all those things from first principles, because, as you said, they do surprising things now. So actually, doing the cognitive science of those systems, I think it's going to happen more.
Yeah. I mean, you make a good point, because I think a lot of AI researchers have started paying attention to the developments in cognitive science, especially in the past 10 to 15 years. And in fact, I saw Yann LeCun, deep learning, one of the founders, or the godfathers of deep learning. It's a bit of a weird term. I hate using the term godfather, but he said any AI researchers don't go into LLMs anymore, because the field is becoming saturated. So look for other paradigms, and that certainly would involve looking at what cognitive scientists are doing on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, I mean, wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna. I mean, I'll leave the last word to you. Any other comments you want to make on what we discussed?
Well, maybe we should talk some other time to talk about rationality and
I would love
more in
that.
depth paper. But I think covering the math is a very good start. for the conversation, and I really enjoyed it. And I hope you learned something, and I hope the listeners also learned something.
Oh yeah, sure did. Despite, having to start for the next week because I'm going to buy all the books, I'm very grateful for your time. Yeah, the map's been useful because I have it just in my desktop. And sometimes now that you give version 3, it's even better. Sometimes I'll just like refer to it to see for like some keywords somewhere and do a Command F and look it up. But no, I think it's a very useful tool. So thank you so much
I
for
can also
taking the time to
say,
create it.
thank you. I'm very happy you like it. One project I would still love to do is I have also this list linked on my website called the Cognitive Science Millennium Project, where I think many researchers together distilled what they think are the 100 most important publications, basically in cognitive science of the 20th century. And I would love to send out this list to current researchers to now, of course, because time has progressed, ask again whether they would, for example, update the list, because maybe other papers are now considered more important, also retrospectively, but also create the 21st century list of like the most important publications of, well, after the year 2000 up to now. That would just be so cool to have. And of course, it has to be a collective effort because it's very hard by one person to decide what should go onto the list.
Yeah. I can't find it on your website, but regardless, I'll email you and then I'll put it in the show notes. That sounds very interesting. Yeah. And we could probably do something. But for sure, regardless, I'd love to have a follow-up conversation, specifically on the work you're doing right now, because this was more like a history lesson. But yeah, once again, thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, pleasure.